Welcome back to Finlos Loves. In this episode, you'll hear the conclusion to my conversation with Eva about communication in relationships. Thanks to everyone who has listened to and commented about this series and for your patience as I wrapped up this episode. As always, feel free to leave questions and feedback to social media by email to finloslives@gmail.com or through the SpeakPipe voicemail box at finloslives.com. And as a bonus, if you stick around until the end, you might get to hear some extra content as well. As you're talking about the behaviors, the one that we're focused on being communication, all of these people learn to shut up and not express what they want. Whether it's Luisa feeling to talk about her song, feeling under pressure all the time because she has the expectation to always be strong, or Isabella, is that the other one's name?
Yeah, Isabella is the oldest, and in her whole spiel is like she feels that she has to be perfect. So there's a sense of perfectionism, which is, one of the like if you've read any of like the liberation work, and I'm trying to remember again, but there are the 10 characteristics of white supremacy, and perfectionism is one of them.
And so when you have things like her being paired up with the male suitor, she does not feel safe enough to express her disinterest, her desire not to do that, or to explore different types of plants. And so it's a really powerful and beautiful image when she gets to have all of these other, not just beautiful, but potentially dangerous plants, which are wild and free and awesome.
Yeah, and I mean, and that have, in so many ways, like their own medicinal capabilities. And I think that was what was really powerful about that imagery for me, is that um a lot of so all of them were like cultural plants, but the softer, like when we think about like roses and stuff like that, right? Like there's a lot of like Eurocentric sort of like imagery around like what's beautiful and like soft, and and like rose petals tend to be that, right? Like rose petals are great, but they're edible, and they're like tonic, and you can make rose water and stuff like that. But somebody looks like a cactus and they're like, okay, what can I do with a cactus, right? But cacti have their own very special healing abilities and care. And so she's now looking at more like sort of like indigenous plants that grow in like harsher environments. And so yeah, there's something really beautiful about her being able to like live into the idea that something doesn't have to look perfect or symmetrical.
And
yeah.
this is completely getting off topic now, but I do find it interesting how the abuela almost seems to be acting as a force of colonial power, because each of the powers that that her three offspring and then the grandchildren, they're all forces of nature. It's the weather, it's taking food and making life energy, it's speaking to animals, it's making things grow, it's feeling into the patterns of life to predict the future. They're all very nature-based things, and yet she restricts them to like perfect European-centric gardens, or building a town, or cooking food, so that way, they're very regulated and very controlled things. And it's only once those things get released as forces of nature again that the magic is able to grow.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's just like how there's parallels to Mirabel and Bruno. One of the things I noticed is that you could draw parallels between some of the other aunts and some of the other children. And so like Tia Pepa is like the one that's sort of in charge of the weather. And so you have like sort of the like unpredictability of the weather based on Tia Pepa's like moods, and then Isabela is the same kind of like, the kind of plants that she's able to grow, or whether they're like a tangle of vines, and what that kind of parallels there too. And And then if you think about Mirabel's mom and her daughter Luisa, they're always in service too. And so these are also very like Latinx roles for women. So they're very gendered roles for women. The idea that like we have to be of service, to other people, but particular, it's like we want to say like to in general we have to be of service, we have to be in service, we have to look a particular way. It's all very gendered, like the one who, and Luisa is actually kind of special in that way, in that like we generally don't get to look strong, and like pick up bridges and move things and stuff, but we actually do. We if you think back to our histories, like there have been so many women who have like run farms and done like labor, and they're just kind of like written out of history. And I love to look back at some of like the revolutionaries in our histories and how they were all women. And you can really talk about Star Wars here, because it's like how a lot of the rebel forces were based off of like Mexican rebel forces, particularly the looks, so the fashions, and how obscured that's been, because we barely hired, but especially with the original trilogy, like we didn't really hire a whole lot of like BIPOC folks. There were a few for sure, but when it comes to
I'm
like
thinking there's one,
Orlando,
and he's not
Orlando
till the
Carlisian,
to the second half of the second movie.
right?
Yeah.
And so you've got like these really super white folks like representing like the fashions of like indigenous and Afro-Caribbean and like revolutionaries and
Yeah, these guerrilla fighters.
los guerrillas. Yes. So I mean, like there's like this amazing just like diversity of like how we communicate, like who we are, what our traumas and tribulations have been. And and I know there's a lot of like Colombia and like in the film, and it's never, and you and I got into this like about whether like for me, like the whole like crossing of the river was almost like a crossing of a frontier. And so it's like the idea of like, we're moving to a new place where it's safer, where it's like, you know and a lot of people think of the United States as that place. And the reality is that the United States has not been that safe place. The United States is a colonized, hostile, uh, colonized place, where the people who are here have been relegated to these really small parcels of land, and their culture's almost extinct. And so we're trying, there's a lot of efforts to like reclaim that. And so even like communication, we can think more broadly about communication, even about in terms of like what are the languages spoken in this country. And we think about English, and people get so upset about Spanish language content. I can't tell you the amount of times that somebody has reached out to me, like this Yo Soy Sam, uh, webinar I'm going to give is in Spanish, because we do this like once a year. Once a year, okay? Once a year. We do it in Spanish so that we are offering content that is culturally specific for advocates of sexual violence who are working with bilingual communities or limited English proficient communities. And I'll inevitably get an email or three, um asking me questions about whether we're going to offer the same content in English. And while while I think that that's important, because we do have a lot of Latinx community that has lost the Spanish language, and Spanish is a colonizer language, and it's like, it's not even, what's really funny for me is that I speak Spanish, and yet the majority of my family is not Spanish, they're Galician, and I don't speak that language. So a colonizing language always seems to win out, and yet like here I am in a foreign country where my Spanish language is what's being erased, and so there is some vulnerability. I feel some vulnerability around like wanting to maintain that, and some also some vulnerability in trying to learn a new language that has been erased altogether, which is like Taino, and feeling like there are just a few places and a few people like truly, really, truly trying to like, and I'm thinking of Casa Areito, so shout out to them and to Priscilla Colon, is the educator who's like really bringing that forward, like and she puts out like YouTube and like Instagram material pretty often. And so I'm like listening to it in both Spanish and English and trying to like and it's so hard, right? Like it's like for it to stick. And some of what sticks is like the stuff that I remember my grandmother. Like I remember my grandmother using words that I didn't realize were Taino words, but that even back then nah, it's like there's a bit of shame associated with like the fact that I acted as a policing force for my grandmother's language when she would work. Like I use this example a lot because it was such a uh it's like it's become a core memory for me now in retrospect, like my grandmother talking about el guanajo, and so I'll tell this story of like how I corrected my grandmother because she used the word guanajo for turkey. We were talking about my grandmother. Um, this was her last um, Thanksgiving, and like I don't like the term Thanksgiving.
No.
So we usually call it like something else. We usually call it either Turkey Day, or we'll call it
Friendsgiving.
Friendsgiving, or we'll call it. As of late, we've been talking about like indigenizing it further, and so we talk about like fall harvest, and as people who don't we're not Christians, so we celebrate in more in tune with like the seasons, and so fall harvest for us, and so indigenizing the fall harvest around some of our more indigenous identities, with Paco's like sort of being more Honduran and me having more like Afro and Caribbean indigenous identities. And so, you know, but yeah, my grandmother was here and celebrating her last Thanksgiving with us. This was what, 2006?
19, 18.
It was 15. November 2015. She died 2016, just as I was starting at the council. And see, there goes that memory. Um, and I was like, "Oh, you mean el pavo, right? Pavo is like the Spanish word for turkey. Guanajo is the indigenous Taino word." And so, like, just kind of realizing my grandmother used a lot of words that were Taino words, and you know whether she we don't know. Like, that's the truth, right? The truth is, I have an idea that we have indigenous heritage, and it's really hard for us to piece those things together because we live in different countries than the countries where our ancestors lived. And so you're often listening for a call, like a call or a like signs from the ancestors about where your journey is taking you. And that's kind of where my journey's been kind of pulling me, right? And so then you have like a lot of questions from people, like even like my cousin recently has been asking me questions because I've been using a lot more uh like the words that I'm learning. I'm trying to reinforce that learning by using them more actively on social media. And so like things like boyique, which just means like healer, or I'll say things like I don't know, but mabrika is welcome. Um, or even, thank you is hahom. Um, and the ones that I'll remember and then I'll commit to memory. And and it's kind of a difficult conversation to have, to communicate about, because it's like I don't have words for that. I have a feeling. And I think that's a little bit of what you were describing earlier, is that like that language fails us in those moments when we have like very strong feelings about what we intuit, and at times when I get to that point, like it's easier to revert back to Spanish for me, because Spanish I think is a more emotional language than English is. English is very like, I don't know, it's very blue to me. It's a very blue language, while Spanish is almost like more yellow, more red, like more warm language. And then Taino is almost like, I don't know, like it's occupying a very interesting like place for me. It's almost like a weird purple. Yeah. And so if I can talk about it as like a color palette, um, as an artist, I think that like my feelings like kind of lead to that, like sort of just thinking about it in terms of palettes. And it feels both familiar and foreign all at the same time. And but all of a sudden, yeah, I'll like find a word that I was like, oh my God, that's the word that we used to, because when we encountered, I think when the Spanish encountered indigenous folks, there were a lot of words for things that were not a part of their daily world, that they were like, oh yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Let me just use that word
Just
because
use that one.
we don't have a word for it. So, so things like huracan,
Hmm.
things like um
Iguana.
iguana. But even Spanish is like that. Even English is like that, right? Like
Oh yeah, for sure.
in Spanish we have a lot of Middle Eastern words, like they come from like the Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
So anything that starts with an uh
Al.
al, yeah, like almohada, pillow, um
Almuerzo.
almuerzo, so those kinds of words. And so I'm used to that idea that language is constantly growing. And so it gives me a lot of permission to I think I used to be a little bit more ashamed of like my first language is Spanish, but then all of a sudden my English was so much more developed than my Spanish, and then I had to really work hard to backtrack and to develop my Spanish a little bit further. And then like I live in a town where I barely ever use my Spanish, so it becomes really rusty. And so a lot of times like the words that I want to use are very like, again, loss of words here, but like the guttural sort of like cuss words usually. Usually I revert very like it's almost like a not infantile, but like sort of like I stub my toe and it really hurts, and like instead of like, fuck, you're just kind of like you'll come out with something like me cago en la leche, and it's like, and people are like, wait, what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But that's like where the emotion takes you to a younger place. And so, and I worry for the girls that they won't necessarily have that. That they won't have like two or more, even more than one, perhaps sometimes. Like we're trying really hard um to expose them to more than one language, and I think sometimes that requires like actually going and living somewhere else. But that, it does something different for your brain to be able to communicate in different world and in a different language. And I don't know, I think you got to feel for what that was like, having to navigate Spain
Mm-hmm.
with me, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, definitely you in those moments you become very in tune with all the ways of communicating, you know, like if I have to go to the pharmacy to request a medication because Eva is in bed with a severe fever and is vomiting, you know, I'm not just gonna go to the pharmacy and say, necesito medicina. Okay, I need medicine. What kind? And then I understand that question. I'm gonna be like, "Ah!" I'm like making the vomit face, and I'm gonna be like, oh, wiping my forehead because I'm hot. Like and I had more words than this. Obviously, I'm kind of exaggerating, but I am pantomiming. I am making noises. I'm making faces as I'm doing my best to use my very. It's not vocabulary. I have a good vocabulary in Spanish, but
It becomes rusty here.
it does, but it become it doesn't matter. I don't want to get into the linguistics of it, but making whole sentences becomes tricky. Um,
But what about Galicia? Because and that's what's tricky about it is like again, like um we make a distinction between like the fact that like and we don't even call it really Spanish in Spain. We call it Castilian.
Castilian, yeah,
And so, like there was this effort to promote Castilian as the um the unifying language of the country in a
right.
country that had several languages,
Many, many,
and where all of a sudden like that was a form of oppression, right? It was a form of fascism, and so many people were kind of practicing their native tongues like secretly. And so I in the aftermath of all of that, and when Franco finally like passed away, and like the country became a like democratic, um a lot of the countries started or a lot of the autonomous regions started to revert back to their native languages. And so we've got like Basque,
mm-hmm. You have
and we've
Basque, you have Catalan,
Catalan and Gallego or Galician and
or in Galician it'd be
Gallego.
Gallego. You have a very different flavor of Spanish in the south than you do in the center. It's still all
Right.
Castilian, but it's a different flavor of it.
Yeah, and it's been really interesting even to find out like like a like I don't even want to talk about genetics because like it's a hot mess, and people do weird things when they find out about their genetics. But it's like yeah, so a big portion of my ancestry is from Galicia, and then another really big chunk of it is from the Canary Islands, which is a completely different place, which is also a colonized place. The Canary Islands are severely colonized by Spain, and so I think like the what would have been considered the indigenous people of that were the Berbers. Um, and they're kind of like a weird, distinct group themselves. And and then further like, okay, yeah, what happened in Cuba? Like, let's talk about how Spanish people still want to ignore the fact that they brought slaves to Cuba, and that through rape and breeding, they kept a slave force and a caste system, and you look at Cuba now, and it's like, it's a, these places, there's a reason why, like, I still feel most comfortable with Caribbean people. Like the Caribbean people in general, like there's a cultural heritage. And anytime I meet somebody from like Miami who's like Caribbean, I'm like, I know we're gonna get along. Whether they're Jamaican or they're from Haiti, or there's enough similarity there that uh that we can find. Whereas like somebody from Tallahassee, like I half the time I don't know how to communicate with them. I don't know how to really find some cultural ground to like we might have like, oh, we're both parents,
Right.
wonderful.
Hmm.
What does that mean for our kids?
We raise our children completely differently.
Completely differently.
Yeah.
And and I find myself like almost like it's it's it requires like a code switching that I'm uncomfortable with, because I feel like I'm being inauthentic when I behave in those ways. And so there we live in a very white neighborhood right now. Thankfully, we have a couple of like your student's mom, is great because she'll come by and I think she's just as starved as me for some cultural like connection, but doesn't know how to say that yet, and we're not quite there yet in terms of like having a relationship. It's a very passive relationship, especially with COVID. But like she's like an actual person of color in the neighborhood. In what is a very old, very southern white neighborhood in Tallahassee, Florida. Whereas I grew up like surrounded by all kinds of people from like Central and South America and Cubans and Haitians, and so I have, and I don't know, I want to be more unapologetic about that, and I hope that as I come more into who I am, I think I will be. But right now, like there are times it's just not worth it to try to explain that you know, to the folks here.
They won't get it.
Well, they won't get it, and they'll feel bad about it, and so that's part of that code switching, right? It's like, what can we talk about that we actually have in common? But I don't like to spend a lot of my energy there, so what I found in Tallahassee is that I do a lot of like just closeting.
Yeah, neither of us do well with small talk, so.
No, I'm definitely not a small talk person. We kid around, but like one of our litmus tests is, can we have a conversation about bodily fluids?
Yep, bodily fluids.
Yeah. And like low bar is periods.
That's easy stuff.
Yeah, periods is easy. Like we can talk about periods, okay, cool. Like, but can we talk about other bodily fluids?
We don't talk about Bruno. No.
Bruno's amazing. I love like the telenovela reenactments behind the scenes with the rats.
With the rats, oh my god, poor guy.
I'm really sad that you didn't get that aspect of Latinx culture um in Miami. I think that I had a very different experience of Jane the Virgin as a result of like having grown up with a mom who engaged in watching telenovelas and who had and having friends who had moms who were like severely
Mm-hmm.
like they were like
Yeah.
shut down, like we must watch Dos
Mhm.
Mujeres Un Camino kind of
Yeah, no.
like bad but like really good.
No.
Yeah.
That is not in my, well, it is now, but like it's not in my native vocabulary.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's because your dad was the one that was Latinx,
My mom likes soaps, but American soaps are not the same.
No, they're not quite. Yeah, they're not quite the same. Yeah, they're not as tropey as the Latinx ones. But I think what was really neat is that you kind of got that in retrospect with a little bit with we were kidding around when we first started this conversation today about Lito.
No, yeah. He totally was born in the midst of one.
Born in the midst.
Yeah.
And there are strengths to that. Like, I think one of the things that one of the strengths of telenovelas is like the rate of high emotion. Like that's something that gets like really stereotyped in American culture as dramatic.
Mm-hmm. Melodramatic.
And actually I think it's a healthy expression of emotion. And it's, I think for a lot of American society, like we've gotten down to the level of like communicating our strong emotions as just problems with mental health. And so we'll want to like put a label on it. Oh, I'm bipolar. Oh, I'm ADHD. Oh, I'm XYZ, right? Like, yeah. And that's not, and as a therapist, that's not to downplay like the fact that there are real health issues that exist in the world. And also just that, you know, as a concept, like as a society and as a concept, like we've dealt with mental health in different ways throughout the eras. You know, sometimes we considered it like demon possession, and sometimes we considered women's issues with rape, things like hysteria. And one of my favorites was borderline personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder was the concept that you were always on the border of either like obsessively uh loving a person or obsessively hating a person, which makes sense when you're being abused by a person.
Yeah.
And that's why I love that diagnosis so much, like in terms of like breaking it down into into what it actually communicated about people in power who were the ones creating those diagnoses. And it's sad because it's like now it's almost like you have to have some kind of diagnosis in order to be able to negotiate your needs.
Yeah. If you're just, I'm just really sad today.
Yeah. No, that's not enough. I'm sorry.
No, I have to be clinically depressed.
You have to be clinically depressed if you really want me
Yeah.
to be able to help you out here.
Yeah. No. Yeah.
Yeah, I think dealing with the state of the world is enough. And you're enough. We are enough.
We are enough. A pearl of wisdom, and full credit to Eva, because this is something that I have practiced with Eva, and thanks to Eva, active listening is something that is really helpful. And it is, some of these things vary from culture to culture because eye contact is not a universal thing.
Mm-hmm.
Hand holding is not a universal thing, but an insurance of engagement with the person with whom you're talking. So for us, that's usually eye contact. And when allowing the person who is speaking to complete the thought,
Mm-hmm.
and then not verbatim repeating the words back because that's obnoxious, but
Mm-hmm.
indicating to the person that you have heard what they said by reflecting it back in your own words.
Yeah, that's really important because often you'll find like, no, that's not what I was saying.
Right. So by doing those things, by actively engaging, by allowing the person to complete their thoughts, and then reflecting the ideas back in your own words, is a way of ensuring that both participants are present in the moment. One is sending, the other is receiving, and at the termination of that bit of communication, there's a confirmation that the message was heard and understood.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems tedious, and sometimes can be tedious, but it is also really, really important, especially in conversations that require nuance, that are emotionally fraught.
Mm.
I think that for me has been something that is extremely helpful. And it becomes streamlined. The more you do it, the less it feels like you're going through that checklist. It's a process, because instead of having to like bounce the idea back to the person, you're just adding on to what they're saying with your own ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And if it makes sense, then you're obviously indicating that you're present and you're listening, and that the message was received, and now you're not bouncing their idea back. You're combining their idea with your own idea to keep the conversation flowing, and that's what a conversation is. But so I think active listening is a very important and valuable skill.
Mm-hmm. Um, so I can't claim this. It's something that I'm trying to practice. But I have notes, so I'm referring to notes here. The acronym HEART and
Not smart.
no, not SMART. SMART is for goals. Heart is for relationships. And so, you know, this is based on the work of a lot of people. So, and I'm not going to be able to credit everyone, but like, you know, if you think about your attachment theories and like the Bowlby studies and all the folks involved in that. And then obviously like I've referenced like throughout this talk like the Gottmans a couple times, but I've also read Polysecure, and so the acronym HEART in this stands for Hear, Express Delight, Attunement, Rituals and Routines, Turning in After Conflict. And so that's the final. And so for here, what they're generally referring to is the idea of being actually present, like being mindful, which I think is part of what you were trying to express in the idea of attentive listening, is that there's you're actually listening, and you're clearly communicating that you're available and receptive to hearing a conversation or to hearing a communication. Express delight, and these are again like things that you should be doing on an ongoing basis, so that they're building up your ability to be in relationship with an individual, whether it be a friend or a partner or a family member. Express delight is the idea of showing pleasure in who the person is, just that they're special to you. And Paco mentioned like uh, eye contact, and so eye contact is important not just like during like a serious conversation that might be uncomfortable, but just at random times, like that they discuss this term, beam gleam, like the idea that you can look at your partner and that look kind of communicates to them that you're like, wow, look at you, like you're some hot stuff, you know. And so that how important that look is, because it communicates to them that like you're really just like you see who they are and you're impressed, and then you're just like really in awe of who they are. And so that's the express delight in the E of heart. Attunement, and attunement is a piece of that like sort of just communication practice, right? Like mirroring back, and Paco talked about that in terms of like sort of paraphrasing back to the individual what it is that you think you're hearing. And so it's sort of like the idea of like, I get you, I see you, I understand you. And then just kind of like just asking on a daily basis, like, you know, how are you? Like, you know, and as often as possible, just like as an open ended question, as opposed to like a very yes or no question. So there's room um, for growing into that conversation. But there are other ways of doing attunement too, like breathing together, sex, being a friend to your partner. And then the R in heart is like rituals and routines. And so we talked a little bit about one of our rituals and routines is the
Coffee date?
Sunday coffee dates
Mm.
is one of the ones that we have. And so but also like, what do you need from your partner at your hellos and goodbyes? You know, there are people who are very anxious about separation. And like I, for example, travel a lot or I used to travel a lot for work before COVID, and now I'm kind of getting back into that rhythm of having to travel. And one of the things that we noticed is that that was like a hard time for Paco. Like Paco really had a just like a reaction to times that I had to travel, and this was something that like he actually encouraged me to get this job, even though when I was the one that was really nervous about traveling at first. And then I don't know if you're willing to admit that was actually harder on you than you thought it was going to be.
That's false.
it was harder on him than he thought it was going to be.
It's true.
It was definitely hard on me. I don't like traveling. I get really nervous around travel. And so one of the strategies that I kind of like started to employ for myself is that when I was traveling by myself, I would try to hit up people who I loved and cared about, who I didn't get to see very often. So if, like a lot of my work takes me into rural communities. And so if I'm, and I'm usually traveling like south of Florida. And so I'd hit like sort of like the Sarasota area and closer to like Glades and Hendry counties, which was closer to Paco's brother, who I was trying to like, he's, uh, so I would try to spend time with Iggy and or usually, and that started to make my travel a lot more pleasant, like because gave me something to look forward to. It gave me like the idea that I was going to be communicating and like connecting to people who I was really, who I have been close to, but who I haven't had the time and space to be closer to. And
And just to clarify, yes, it is hard for Eva. It's hard for me for Eva to not be here.
yeah, um, and it's and it's hard for the kids too. And that's a part of it because the parent who stays behind us like all of a sudden is responsible for 100% of like the emotional labor of the kids too. So I own that, you know.
And I think, and that's the ritual. I think part of the anxiety is that some of those rituals are interrupted, and so
Yeah.
you know, it's not just that we have coffee dates on Sunday. I make coffee for Eva every
Every day.
morning,
Yeah, every morning.
and it's yes, I do it because it brings her joy and it makes the morning routine more pleasant. But it's also part of my ritual for getting my day going, and it's also a way of making me feel connected to my partner. It's a way that I give care. It's a way that I show affection. It's a way that I bring her pleasure. It's a way,
Mhm.
all of these things. And so just that one small thing of not being able to do, like, to make that cup of coffee, it in the grand scheme of a day, it's not a lot, but in terms of emotional fulfillment,
Mhm.
it's a very significant thing. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
losing those little things in a day is a source of distress.
Yeah, and for my part, like I don't like in a lot of these rural communities, it's really hard to get a good cup of coffee. So often I actually will forego or yeah, I'll usually forego or we'll try to make ahead and like take with and that will be like something that's a sort of in between space that we've figured out is like okay, maybe we can make like a big pitcher of like coffee for me to take uh but over like 3 days like the same coffee like it doesn't taste the same.
Nope.
Um and so it'll either start to taste weird and I'll throw it out or it'll taste weird from being in the metal tin and so I'll develop like headaches and like travel is not like it's not a super like work travel is not a super fun thing for me generally and another technique that I've kind of like currently developed is that if you have a friend or who is working remotely like maybe travel with your friend and that way like you're not just like I'm really bad about driving on the road and I hate driving. And so if you even have just somebody to share the drive with it, that's helpful, but it's still and I agree like that broken routine um is hard and so you have to like develop new routines to help you stay connected while you're on the road. And so one of the things that we do is we use Marco Polo a lot. And so the kids will still be able to give me because we have a nightly routine of like doing highs and lows while we do dinner. And so even if we're like right now we're for example we're fasting at nights, um, and we still do dinner. We'll still cook dinner. The kids will still do dinner, and we'll still do highs and lows. But when I'm not here because I'm working, like I'm not here for the highs and lows, and so the kids and Paco will still record their highs and lows for me on Marco Polo, and that means a lot to me because I can like no matter what time of day it is, even if it's like 1 a.m. in the morning, I'm able to like watch that video and be like feel like I was still consideration, still part of that conversation, and still part of like the family dynamic that night because it was recorded for me. Even if I'm not able to necessarily like reciprocate that in the moment, like they understand like that I'm reciprocating that in my own way by like being away for a job that I'm.
And like what you were saying earlier about how we communicate, what we're communicating to our children is that like mommy is not here, but mommy is still important, and those relationships are important.
Yeah, object permanence is real. And then the last, so we hit the R in heart, and then the last one is T, is turning in after conflict. And so repairs, we're gonna mess up, and repairs, when we have to make them, have to be genuine. We have to take responsibility for our actions, and the truth is that the ability to repair is going to depend greatly on how many deposits we've been making into the relationship account as a general. And so if there are a lot of reasons to be upset, if there are a lot of reasons to not trust, if your conversations haven't been going well, if your needs haven't been met, if your partner has not been good about being accountable for their actions, or if you've felt extremely gaslit, anything like that is going to impact how that conflict goes. And so that, I think that's why conflict is so scary for a lot of people, because they people know when they haven't been showing up, you know. They know when they've been avoiding conflict, they know when they haven't been showing up, and they definitely know when they're being sneaky and when you're calling them on their bullshit. They do. And that's not on you. That's not, that's definitely not on you when you're being authentic and genuine and trying to show up and have the conversations and the other person's not budging. And so these are important. Like, is your partner able to be present, right? Are they here? Are they able to attune to you? Are they mirroring? Are they understanding you? Are they seeing you and genuinely interested in who you are? Are you finding that you're able to establish like rituals and routines together? What are those? And are you turning in after conflict? You know, and the important thing about like turning in after conflict is that it assumes that you engaged fully in conflict. Like, that's not like stated, but it's like sort of like, yeah, duh. Like, you have to have actually had the conflict. So if you're avoiding the conflict, you can't really turn in after conflict.
And to be clear, conflict is not like there are many conflict. I think that a lot of us envision conflict as being fights or violent. And I think conflict gets to those extremes because they are avoided for too long.
Yeah.
And so they become they blow up. I think if what we're talking about ideally is disagreements, discomforts, concerns, insecurities, which over time, if they are avoided, become bigger problems because they manifest in boundary crosses and
Mhm.
harms and what's the word I'm looking for? Deceitfulness.
Mhm. Yeah, and also because you're not attuned, right? Like that is one of the pieces of that acronym that they offer, is if you're attuning to your partner, you're aware of when there is a charged moment. You're attuned to like a mood shift. And I'll often say to people like, okay, what was that face? What was that? Like, what was that? That's a very common one for me, is like, wait, something just happened there. Like I'm very sensitive to shifts in mood, shifts in um, in body language. And, you know, you asked that question early on, like, oh, what is it? Like, what is conversation? Just conversation is not just language, obviously. It isn't. But, you know, what we pick up on and what we think we actually express um, in our bodies is very different. And we also can't assume to know what it is that an individual is expressing. Although I will say that I think I am fairly accurate in my reading after 20 years of you know, and unfortunately because I am a therapist, like I have uh some training in like how to be a little bit more neutral about my body language. And but when I'm in a relationship with people and I'm not trying to do therapy, like I try to be as genuine as I can be, and often like I'm pretty sassy.
It's true.
I am pretty sassy, and like I'll let you know. Like I don't feel a need to like hide what I'm feeling.
There is sass.
Yeah, there is sass. I think that's where Gally gets it from.
True, that one's sassy.
That one's sassy.
That one's sassy.
She's so sassy.
Spicy sass.
Communication is like an ongoing. Don't think that like communication. Obviously, like communication is not going to be like a one-time thing. You're gonna have to figure out communication with each individual that you're involved with, and like
Yeah, and don't assume that the way that you communicate with one person is going to work with the next.
no, yeah, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's part of why it's an ongoing process, because like we're constantly trying to figure out like each other's languages and what makes us tick, and like, you know, and I've definitely had failed friendships and relationships as a result of, you know, conversational or communication styles that just didn't line up because people were so insecure, you know, that they couldn't stay connected and grounded.
Mhm. Yeah, I think insecurities are often the source of many relationship issues, including communication. So yeah, I think that honesty about what makes you insecure, and clearly communicating that as it comes up is really important,
Mm-hmm.
because we all have insecurities.
Oh yeah.
Thanks parents, and thanks life, and
Thanks life.
thanks movies, and thanks social media, and all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
4 hours later,
Signing out. The doctor is out.
the doctor has left the podcast.
89. Como mi Evita van a llevarla a Estados Unidos, a Miami, dentro de unos meses, según tienen en proyecto sus padres que quieren irse allí. Ella muchas veces me ha pedido, después de oír las grabaciones que tengo aquí en esta misma cassette de su madre, recopiladas, pues me ha pedido que quería también ella grabar o que le grabara su voz. Así que lo voy a hacer ahora y a ver qué dice ella. A ver, Eva, habla tú.
Hola, buenas tardes. ¿Qué tal?
Bien.
Qué feliz estoy con mi abuelito, que me compra tantas cosas. Qué feliz que me cuida y me compra comiditas ricas. Qué feliz, qué feliz, qué feliz, qué feliz.
Qué bonito.
Qué bonito.
Cuánto te agradezco que digas esto, bonita, que nadie te lo ha dicho. Lo has dicho tú porque has querido, porque te ha salido del alma. Di más cosas, canta, canta, bonita mía.
Qué es que no me sé ninguna canción.
Bueno, pues di cosas para que cuando seas mayor...
Porque eran muñecas. Y tengo ahí una cosa...
¿Qué te han traído los reyes?
Una muñeca que canta y que anda.
¿Y cómo se llama?
María.
Marian. Uy, qué bonita es. ¿Y has jugado mucho con ella?
Sí.
¿Y a tus hermanos que les han traído, sabes algo?
Sí, a mi hermano un patito y a mi hermano un coche.
Uy, qué bien. ¿Y tú te vas contenta con papá y mamá a Estados Unidos?
No.
¿No? Ay, qué pena. Pues yo quisiera que fueras contenta, porque así me quedaba yo más tranquilo. Pues bien, si te llevan, hija, ellos son tus padres. Y
Qué
tienen
feliz, qué bueno es mi abuelo.
Bueno, ya lo has cantado, hija, ya no. Yo sí he procurado, dentro de lo que pude, cuidarte, darte cariño, darte comida, darte todo lo que has querido, todo lo que he podido, buenamente. Sé que...
Yo lo pongo para que oiga yo lo que he dicho.
Bueno. Esto que hemos grabado ahora salió bien y Eva está toda contenta escuchando su voz, como me pidió muchas veces que grabáramos. Sí. Espera un momentito. Esto se ha grabado el día 23 de enero de 1989. Lo había dicho al principio, pero no salió todo. Solamente salió 1989 y eso no nos dice nada, por eso aquí lo repito. Ahora, di cosas.
Mis hermanitos están en el barrio de Pilar, pero yo prefiero estar con mi abuelito.
Y tenías que ir al colegio, porque
Sí.
te lleva a un colegio donde comes allí y estás allí con muchas niñas y con muchos niños, juegas mucho allí, pero has estado un poquito constipada y por eso no has ido estos días. Ahora tienes que volver. ¿Vas contenta al colegio?
Bueno, sí.
Bueno, sí o no, porque...
Sí.
Claro, bueno, pues sí, no chilles para que salgan, nos hagan botes aquí fuertes. Bueno, ¿y la señorita te quiere?
Ay, no pega a todos los niños que lo hacen mal.
Pega, pero no dices que no pegan. Castigan, ¿no? ¿Y cómo castigan? Dilo aquí.
Con las manos en la cabeza.
Oh, pero ese castigo no es nada. Te tienen así un poquito y luego ya te mandan estar normal. ¿Y te gusta la comida del colegio?
Bueno, depende, sí.
Algunos días sí.
Sí.
¿Y cuál te gusta más? ¿La que hace el abuelo en casa o la que comes allí en el colegio? Di la verdad.
La que hace el abuelo.
¿De verdad, de verdad?
Sí.
Bueno, pues mira, también me satisface mucho eso. Yo no sé mucho de cocinar, hija, pero hago lo que puedo. Y a veces más de lo que puedo.
Señoras y señoras, mi abuelito es muy bueno y esta pared la ha pintado tu papá, pero mira qué mal la ha pintado.
Bueno, sí, porque nos hace daño cuando nos rozamos ahí, porque tiene muchos pinchos. Pero ellos no sabían hacerlo mejor, hija. Lo han hecho así y demasiado bien. Ahora ya no puedo una regla hasta que se lo pintan.
Ahora para ver lo que he dicho.
Bueno, comprobado que salió todo lo anterior bien, porque este casé graba muy bien. Y ahora, ¿quieres decir algo más?
No, depende, no.
Ya no, ya lo quitamos, ya no.
Pero quiero oír lo que he dicho ahora.
No, pero ahora no he dicho nada, si no,
Sí, he dicho la cosa.
si lo acabas de oír. Así
No.
¿qué querías decir? ¿Qué quería decir antes que me estaba hablando? De que querías hablar de cosas. ¿Has visto si han comido todo el pan que le pusimos las palomas?
Sí, señores.
Bueno. Y ahora, después de merendar, ¿a dónde quieres que salgamos?
A la calle a dar una vueltecita y a buscar el coche.
¿Y qué más?
Y luego a comprar pañales.
¿Y qué más? ¿Qué más? Comida también, ¿no?
Comida, bueno, depende.
Bueno, comida tenemos todavía cosas.
Bueno, sí.
Pero, en fin, no sé.
Con estas manitas.
Hay que mirar a ver si hace falta algo.
No, y ahora puedo parar lo que he dicho.
Sí. Habla lo que quieras, anda.
A la la la, a la la la, yo me siento muy feliz con mi abuelo, pero
Bueno,
mi abuelo
pero-
se le perdió la vista.
Ya.
Tiene unas gafitas, porque ya muy viejo,
Ya
tiene
la-
poco celo.
Ya lo has dicho muchas veces, ahora ya di lo que quieras aquí. Ya sé que me quieres mucho y que dices esto.
Chu, 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 que la paloma, una paloma comía mucho, pero
Sí,
una vez una,
Si no
¿sabes lo que le pasó?
escucha, si no te llevan a Miami, nos vamos tú y yo a Galicia.
Ya lo-
Si te dejan tus padres aquí, nos vamos tú y
Sí,
yo a
pero
Galicia.
te ves una...
Y si no te dejan, pues hija, tienes que ir con ellos.
hijos,
Por allí,
caballeros y
allí tienes otros
caballeros y
abuelos.
caballeros.
Cállate, no enseñes así. Allí tienes otros abuelos y tías. Y allí, pues...
Yo quiero ir.
Sí, y
Voy a
allí,
decir
y allí si,
Ay,
si te va bien, estarás también muy contenta, quizás mejor que aquí. Así que...
ahora quiero ir.
Vamos a ver.
Que
A
voy a
ver,
decir una cosa.
¿Quieres ir? ¿Te gusta,
Mira,
te gusta estar con el abuelo en Lugo?
Sí,
¿Y por qué te gusta estar con el abuelo en Lugo?
porque él me hace muchas cositas y me cuida, me hace todas estas cositas.
Bueno, muchas cositas no te hace. Te da cariño, te da besitos, te cuida, te da medicinas, te compra ropitas, todo lo que necesitas, porque es necesario. Si estás conmigo tiene que ser así. Si no, pues ¿para qué te iba a tener? Si no te fuera...
Pero señor, sí señora, esto me está dando.
Ahora, ¿te gusta estar en Lugo?
Sí, señora.
¿Y por qué te gusta estar allí?
Porque con muchos primos mi abuelo me compra, me hace cosas, me da besitos, me da todas una cosa.
Sí. Bueno, pues nada.
Yo le voy a cantar una canción.
Ah.
Unas palomas comían mucho, pero una vez una paloma salió mal y un día huevos saca la paloma, se cayeron las alas y explotó.
Bueno, pues...
Bueno,
ya está.
Los pajaritos se hicieron grandes, huevos iban volando, pero uno huevo se hacía viejo, pero no le pasó nada. Y como Evo podía con toros y los patas, y podía con toros más. Ya puedo para que oiga lo que he dicho.
Ya está, ya no podemos más.
No,
Ya está.
señora,
Si no dices más que... No dices más que...
Yeah, that's what it is right now.
Mm.
One nostril to rule them all.